Welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. This is episode 2, the operation of the organic metaphor, or actually the organic metaphor. So we spoke last week in episode 1 about the operation of the metaphor, and we talked about it in general. Then I said what I was going to do is break it up into the next 3 sessions where I was going to talk about um, the natural metaphor, which is the basis and the essence of this prospect, and then basically what we call the aesthetic metaphor, which is I think what we're more familiar with. And then basically I was going to talk about some cultural social things and what I call unbreakable bonds, which is things specific to but valuable, consequential. So again, we spoke briefly last week about the fact that we have the idea of analogy, simile, metaphor, and we think of these things as language constructions. But what I think we're missing is the fact that we have not just an analogy, but a kind of essence that's kind of founded in the fact that this operation is not something that we invented, but something we discovered and kind of find a kind of usefulness in terms of what it can do in language, but it's not something that exists inside language. I remember a piece where Bronowski critiqued um, Chomsky, and he spoke about the fact that Chomsky had this idea that language was kind of in, I think it's Cartesian, his piece on Cartesian language by Chomsky, where he talks about the fact that there was a division between animal language and human language, and that human language was separate and somehow not following from the if I remember correctly, not following from the animal language because of the fact that there was a kind of like less instinctive aspect. But this was kind of like the wrong approach, and though Bronowski held him accountable for the fact that the instinct wasn't the case, that there was a correlation. But the thing is, the correlation wasn't specified in Bronowski's critique. But I think the correlation is one from the idea of the generative accretion, natural context of what I would call selection. So we start with that. We start with the fact that, we have selection as the remnant of a series of accretions that go back to the fact that we find as we go through 13.7 or 8 billion, 3.78 billion on Earth, or whatever the numbers are, we find ourselves going from simple to more complex. And we find that because of a sense of kind of what I would call entanglement, and then a sense of accretion, and then transfiguration. And I don't mean transfiguration in a kind of like, kind of a religious sense, but that the fact that these things basically form new things. Like we spoke about concepts, and I gave some examples last week. And I mean, a good example here is that we look at the fact that when things join, they have similar features, but they also give rise to more consequential features that become the basis of the new object itself. I mean, we start with energies, and then we end up with particles. We go from particles and we end up with elements. We go from elements, we go to amino acids. Again, I'm skipping steps, but we find that as a result, once we get to amino acids, we can form proteins, we can form living beings, and we can kind of have consciousness, and then we have society. And so there's all these levels of complexity that seem to kind of go against the natural sense of what we would call entropy, which is what we have a tendency to, because we notice and we see when things come apart, but we kind of don't really understand how it is that things naturally accrete. But if we spend the time and we're patient and we look at things, we will find that, in fact, this does take place. I remember once I was drawing at the Metropolitan Museum, and I had noticed that these things that start with energies and particles and then kind of like accrete into larger things become entangled. So I noticed that, just this kind of natural, this silly thing, like, people lose hair and the hair kind of drops off them, and, things fall to the ground. People are constantly giving things away. But just as a result of the wind and these things, there were these formations of these little kind of like tumbleweeds. And these tumbleweeds basically became this new thing. Now, this was just an incidental, kind of inconsequential thing, but it wasn't just the fact that the hair itself, in its sense, just kind of continued to, degrade. It found through this sense of entanglement of the, discarded follicles, a way to entangle with others and then form larger groups. Kind of the same way that particles form and their energies basically compound to the point where if we have enough compression of elements of hydrogen, we create a star. So these accretions, or these entanglements, right, because of the nature of these articles, have some sense of consequence in the fact that they form new objects. So is a star foreseeable from the aspect of the energies at the beginning of the universe? We can now go back and retrace that. And I guess it is foreseeable in the fact that if you knew what to look for, you could see that this was inevitable. But the reality is it something we can see? And to what degree of analysis would we get to be able to see that? So anyway, that's what I see is actually the case in terms of the creation or the generative aspect of metaphor. This same operation. What we're doing is we're taking entities and they're becoming entangled. And as a result of their accretion and the processes of the energies within themselves, they form new things. So a star is a result of the gravity, the mass, well, not the mass and the particles and the energies to form something larger than itself, than it had before it reaches that critical point. So then we get to the point, another example is the fact that we have particles that form elements. The elements then basically have a series of structures. Those structures come together and that we have carbon. Carbon basically gives rise to amino acids. Amino acids give rise to proteins. And as a result, we see these things where we have the basis of the operations of human life. Now, it takes a long period of time, but these things do come to account. So the reality is we understand this as the fact that these things, and as we spoke about the fact that there are, these aspects where, there's a consequential formulation that these things come about. And that we saw in the aesthetic metaphor we talked about with Ortega y Gasset, and the idea of like the cypress is a ghost of the dead flame, the fact that being able to see the value of the creation, or to see the fact that it can exist without being recognized, is something we need to accept, we need to acknowledge. And I think one of the, for me, one of my heroes, one of my great heroes, is Alfred North Whitehead. And I can't say I'm a Whitehead scholar, but I'm a Whitehead admirer. And his process system, I think, also as he was a great admirer of Hume and his skepticism project, there's concepts of usefulness and utility and value came to the point where this is how we see this natural process as things kind of like selecting and sustaining in nature. So we generate stars, we generate planets, we generate organic compounds, we generate life. We know that these things exist, at least in our consequence. I think it's reasonable to assume that it's possible we're going to find these things in other contexts. There's a great little piece of the video. I mean, I don't know how far back some people go, but one of the things I loved was, I remember I was in college at the time when Carl Sagan did the original Cosmos series, where he showed something that I think is lost to a lot of what today they're called popularizers, or the public intellectuals who deal with the aspects of science and its value. What Carl Sagan did, which was really brilliant, was he showed the overwhelming awe of these aspects to be studied in cosmology, astrophysics, and things like that. And he wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He was trying to show people the absolute overwhelming awe of the magnitude of these discoveries. And he has this little vignette, which I think is just a couple of minutes long, but I've seen it on YouTube. You can find it, where he basically traces through a series of line drawings. And in each one, there's a kind of like an addition. That addition is consequential, like we would have in a mutation. And that mutation kind of creates a kind of new entanglement with something else, which basically allows for something else to take place. And the reason I say that is like when we have, the carbon structure with its hexagonal shape has the ability to kind of give rise to kind of like amino acids and polypeptide chains and ultimately, kind of proteins. And it's all because of this structure. Now, it doesn't happen hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron. It doesn't happen with boron or hydrogen, helium. It happens with 6 because of the fact that the configuration allows for this kind of opportunity. And then, we've had people in science fictions, kind of like talk about the fact that silicone and I think argon are in that same kind of like neighborhood. So the possibility that maybe there's possibilities that the same kind of things with the amino acids could come from that similar structure. In fact, I think there was a scientist who found something in the salt flat in California with this, like, was it like silicone or argon based? I know they talked about it in Star Trek, which was a cool show. Original Star Trek, Captain Kirk Star Trek. I mean, I'm not a Jean-Luc, but I mean, Jean-Luc Picard seemed like a cool guy. I didn't like anything after that, but the original Star Trek, the silicone-based life form, and I kind of thought that was cool. But anyway, it's a realistic possibility. And in the art science complex, we deal with this kind of correlation between half of us are artists, half of us are scientists, some are neither, but we have a lot of fun talking about these different aspects. So anyway, in that case, that idea gives rise to this possibility. Now, one of the things that Whitehead talks about in process philosophy is things are not in this kind of typical kind of like metaphysical sense that we've had since Parmenides. It kind of goes back to Heraclitus, where he talks about the fact that things are constantly in flux. So instead of a nature of being, as ontology being the nature of being, ontology becomes the nature of becoming. And what makes something valuable in the sense of becoming is that its essence come from its consequence. So that, the prehensive actually kind of becomes something that has in itself almost a selective capacity. So I think in Whitehead, he was the person coming in end of the 20th century, end of the 19th into the 20th century, moving from logic and mathematics into history of science and then into philosophy and into metaphysics. I think he understood the idea that it was clear based on a lot of the discoveries that had been made at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that it was really kind of possible to extend this possibility of process into metaphysics and basically get out of this kind of somewhat stumbling block of kind of like unchangeable essence. That essence wasn't unchangeable, that it becomes entangled. And what I would call kind of like, what I would call in the sense, what would it say? I have the term where it's like, it's, unbreakable bonds. And by unbreakable bonds, it's like that fact that these things come together because they show a certain consequence. Now, again, because of Hume's skepticism, and Whitehead read deeply into Hume, that idea that something may or may not be ever understandable, consequential, and definable, right? It has a certain utility. And I use the example of a map. A map may have incorrections in it. It may not exist, but it has a utility. And that, in fact, it allows you to kind of traverse certain territories and discover certain things and be able to kind of like add information to it. So does the map ultimately exist in the fact that we can know it to be ultimately true and infallible? Maybe not. But the fact that it serves a certain utility means it has something that can be of consequence. So the unbreakable bond are the things that basically kind of like help us accrete towards something of that nature. And Adventures in Ideas kind of like Whitehead also takes that and he charts that through history in terms of the idea of coming to civilization and progress. I mean, one of the ambitious statements that he has in that book, is the fact that civilization seems to be like the selective process, inevitable, or I don't know if inevitable is a word correct philosophically, but the fact that over time things go from a kind of simpler to a more complex state, so that society kind of moves from certain things from a simpler to a more complex reality. And it seems reasonable. I mean, there are kind of certain things, just like in the case of any kind of like organism, that organisms basically, if they're not capable of adapting, they disappear. And we've seen the fact that, like, the fossil record is full of examples of what wasn't the right choice at the time. So anyway, that's basically the premise, which is the fact that that idea, of this, of the metaphor as simply an operation of language is just not really the correct analogy. That it's more correct if we actually look at it in terms of the natural process by which we have the accretion and movement from simplicity to complexity. So that's kind of where I think we kind of maybe mistake some of the things that kind of like happen linguistically, and that there's an obsessive, I guess, because we use language to operate within the metaphor, we think of it as exclusively as a language generative process, which I don't see any reason to kind of see that. I see that as basically the entanglement of concepts or objects or properties, which exist beyond simply the conceptual realm. So we can exist with them within the conceptual realm, but they can also exist independently. So that's pretty much this aspect, as it kind of traces through that as I see it. So I kind of think that for me, this was a kind of useful idea to get to that. So that is that's the basis. So that from the natural, from the organic, from the organic metaphor, we're more likely to be able to, kind of like understand the artificial, or what I call people more likely to think of it as the aesthetic metaphor, but I call it the artificial because, again, I'm talking about it in relationship to the selective. So, it's like the organic as opposed to the artificial, in the Darwinian terms. So there's natural metaphor, I guess, and there's organic metaphor. I mean, no, wait, there's natural metaphor and there's artificial metaphor. My mind slipped there for a minute. But I think within the Darwinian terms, that makes certain sense. So, artificial metaphor is just basically it's not, it would be, I guess, it might be a reasonable kind of like analogy to draw between the two things. Why am I talking about this? I talk about this because I think it's very much at the essence of what I do as a researcher, and more as an architect, in terms of the objects that I generate. Because I think about the fact that, like, the way in which things go together to kind of form new things is something that is a really beautiful thing, and I think it's been capably used in literature and in painting, but not so successfully in architecture. And I think that is something that I felt kind of keeps us away from the organic aspect, which I think is my goal as an architect. So that's basically that. I kind of think that I was fairly concise, read a little bit longer than I thought. So we're at 19 minutes. So in closing, let me say that next week we will be talking about what I call the artificial or the kind of like aesthetic metaphor, and that will be the process by which we're talking about the way in which things kind of go together, that we understand them artistically. So next week, which is today is the 8th, that'll be the 15th. We will be speaking about the the artificial or aesthetic metaphor. And then the next week, which I guess will be the 22nd, we'll be talking about unbreakable bonds or the proto-metaphor, or basically more like a sociological or cultural metaphor. And we'll kind of like, so that's basically it. So I hope, anyone starts to see these things. They start, short note. Tonight, Create Matter on YouTube. Warren Edwards, good buddy of mine, along with his colleague and my colleague, Robert Sims III, did a profile of Art Science Complex, the first of a series that they've published. And I think if it's not up, it will be up soon. We saw the I guess the unedited version, right? The final edit, which was kind of, it made me look better than I think I am. So I was like, man, if you guys could make me look this good all the time, this would be great, so anyway, that when happened. So that, if you get a chance and you're interested, go look at that. It talked a little bit more specifically about, some of the work in process. The real good thing though is the next one is on Julie Rauer. So, I told Warren, I said, look, if you can make me look this good, I mean, when they actually see someone who has something to say, it's going to be quite epic. So let's leave it at that, and let's close with our usual. Hi, Puddle.
Hi, Puddle.
Hi. So what are we listening to over there on?
Eric Satie.
Oh, Satie.
Naciens, 1 to 4.
Turn it up. Turn this to closing. So let's close with here. Oh, that's beautiful. I love Satie. All right. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to all of our benefit to keep it just that way. Good night.